April 1945 settled over the Bavarian woods with a cold stillness that weighed as heavily as the surrender itself. German prisoners marched slowly through the fog, their boots sinking into days-old mud, uniforms soaked and sagging. Most kept their eyes fixed on the ground, unsure whether looking up meant disrespect or danger. They moved quietly, as if afraid even their breath might provoke the wrong reaction from the American guards ahead. Many were barely older than schoolboys, faces drawn thin by hunger and sleepless nights. Their oversized helmets rattled with every unsteady step. For weeks they had lived on rumors, stories that Americans tortured or shot prisoners without hesitation. Truth had been swallowed by fear, and fear had become the only guide they trusted. Surrender felt less like safety and more like stepping into a future shaped entirely by strangers. Sergeant Thomas Cole watched the line approach from his jeep, arms folded against the cold. He had crossed beaches, hedgerows, and ruined cities, witnessing death in every imaginable form. Yet something in these prisoners unsettled him more than open combat ever had. There was no defiance left in them, no hatred, just a hollow exhaustion, the look of men who had spent their final reserves of courage days before lifting their hands. For months they had been fed a steady diet of propaganda and horror stories. Some swore Americans humiliated captives, others whispered they executed teenage soldiers on the spot. Even the calm posture of the guards offered little comfort. To men who had known only brutality as discipline, gentleness itself felt suspicious. The final days of the war had blurred kindness and danger into a single indistinct threat. When they reached the temporary holding area, barbed wire wrapped around rough wooden stakes, the column instinctively stiffened. Smoke from a burned village lingered in the damp air, mixing with the smell of wet earth and old fear. The prisoners halted without being told, unsure whether movement would be seen as disobedience. No one knew if this place meant survival or disappearance. Silence held them together more tightly than any order. Sergeant Andrew Mason stepped forward, his German steady and clear as he explained the procedures: registration, medical checks, rest, and food when possible. But even spoken gently, the words seemed to tighten the prisoners' fear rather than ease it. They had lived too long under officers who used calm voices to hide cruelty. Every instruction, no matter how simple, felt like a doorway to unknown consequences. One of the youngest prisoners, little more than a boy, stumbled when asked to remove his rucksack. His knees buckled, and Mason instinctively reached to steady him. The boy recoiled instantly, shrinking back with a flinch so sharp it startled the guards. It wasn't Mason he feared, but the memories stitched into every inspection he had endured under his own army's hands. Trauma answered faster than logic could. Older prisoners attempted to maintain the posture of trained soldiers, but the facade cracked under exhaustion. Muscles trembled beneath uniforms stiff with dried sweat and dirt. Their eyes darted between guards' movements, searching for signs of danger. It was the look of men who had learned to read violence in the smallest gestures and now struggled to believe they might actually be safe. The American guards, seasoned by months of fighting, saw the fear plainly. They moved slowly, deliberately avoiding sudden commands or raised voices. No one wanted an already broken line of men to panic. The war was ending, and none of them wished to spill blood on its final slope. Yet fear had momentum, and it clung to the prisoners like a second skin. During roll call, many prisoners had no identification left, lost in retreats, bombings, or chaos. When Mason asked for names, voices emerged barely above whispers, shaped by trembling breath. Some believed answering incorrectly might label them spies. Others feared that even speaking too loudly could provoke punishment. Every syllable seemed heavy with the cost of survival. Near the rear of the line, an older man clutched his chest, gasping for air as fatigue overwhelmed him. Sergeant Cole signaled a medic immediately. But instead of relief, the prisoner's panic deepened as the medic approached. Years of coercion disguised as medical treatment had carved their mark into him. His hands shook violently, not from illness alone, but from the expectation of pain. Mason knelt beside him, repeating softly, "Wir helfen Ihnen," "We're helping you." But reassurance slid off the man like water off stone. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for deception. War had trained him to associate uniforms with demands, not care. Even compassion felt dangerous. His fear was not stubbornness, it was experience speaking louder than words. Inside the registration tent, prisoners hesitated before removing helmets and caps, as if surrendering the last pieces of who they once were. The walls of canvas amplified every sound, the scribble of pens, the shuffle of boots, the rustle of paper, turning the small space into something claustrophobic. Many held their breath, bracing for the moment kindness changed into cruelty, as it often had under their own officers. Captain Horace observed quietly from outside, arms tucked behind his back. He had seen hardened SS units crumble and civilians flee burning towns, but this scene struck him with a heavier weight. These prisoners weren't filled with hate or fanaticism. Most looked like farmers, factory workers, or students dragged into a war they never understood. Their fear was almost childlike in its depth. During inspections, one prisoner clutched a worn photograph, a woman cradling an infant. His fingers tightened around it when told to set it aside. Horace saw the man's panic rising and allowed him to keep it, understanding that such memories were sometimes the only thing these men had left. Taking it would serve no purpose but cruelty. War had already stripped enough from them. From a distance, two prisoners whispered nervously in German. They weren't plotting escape. They were wondering whether the Americans would feed them that day or leave them waiting until morning. Their voices carried a trembling hope, the kind that hurt more than despair. Starvation had become such a constant companion that imagining a warm meal felt almost dangerous. Then, carried by a shift in the wind, came the unmistakable aroma of stew from the American field kitchen, rich, warm, and almost dreamlike. The prisoners lifted their heads cautiously, as if the scent itself might vanish. It was a smell many had nearly forgotten, real food, seasoned and hot. For a moment, their expressions flickered with something fragile, hope trying to surface. After counting finished, Sergeant Cole told them to sit and rest. But most remained standing, their bodies rigid with caution. Sitting felt like a privilege they weren't sure they were allowed. Even small comforts had become memories of another life. The guards exchanged thoughtful glances, realizing how deeply fear had carved itself into these men. Light snow drifted down, melting as it touched warm skin and worn fabric. Several prisoners looked upward, surprised to feel something gentle after so many months of violence. For a brief moment their faces softened, no longer soldiers nor captives, but simply men remembering what it felt like to notice the world beyond their fear. As dusk approached, lanterns in the camp were lit, casting a warm glow across the muddy ground. The prisoners watched the light flicker inside the tents, unsure what tomorrow would bring. But for the first night in a long time, no barking orders, no explosions, no threats followed them into darkness. They did not yet know that the next day would challenge everything they feared and believed about their captors. The second morning broke colder than the first, a thin layer of frost glazing the tents and turning every breath into a pale cloud. The German prisoners stirred slowly, unsure whether waking meant another day of survival or the beginning of something far worse. They watched American medics preparing tables and equipment, their movements calm, purposeful, almost gentle. Yet every gesture made the POWs tense, expecting pain hidden inside kindness. Inside the registration tent, Corporal Mason arranged stacks of forms while glancing toward the line of prisoners waiting outside. Their faces carried the same mixture of dread and confusion he had seen yesterday. But today, there was something else too, an alertness born from uncertainty. Some clutched scraps of identification, others carried nothing but fear. Mason braced himself for questions he knew they were too afraid to ask. A young POW stepped forward first, shoulders rigid, trying to slow his trembling. His voice cracked as he said his name, barely audible over the rustling of canvas. The American clerk nodded gently, writing without judgment. But the boy kept watching the pen as if every stroke determined whether he lived or died. His fear was not irrational, it was conditioned, etched by years of brutal authority. Outside, the prisoners gathered in tight clusters, whispering about the examinations rumored to follow. Some believed the Americans wanted to check for hidden weapons. Others feared they would be probed for information. One older man shook his head, insisting that calm voices were the most dangerous. His hands shook as he said it, betraying memories he could not unlive. The air carried more tension than the morning wind. When the first group entered the medical tent, they froze at the sight of equipment laid neatly on a long wooden table. Bandages, stethoscopes, thermometers, ordinary tools, yet terrifying to men accustomed to brutality disguised as procedure. The medics didn't rush. They greeted each prisoner with quiet professionalism, but friendly silence was still silence, and silence remained frightening. A middle-aged POW tried to explain in broken English that he was healthy, no need for examination, but his voice trembled too much to sound convincing. The medic gently gestured for him to sit, lifting the man's sleeve only enough to check his pulse. The POW winced as if expecting a blow. Instead, he felt only 2 fingers resting calmly on his wrist. Soft, measured, impossibly foreign. In the next station, Mason translated every instruction with slow, cautious diction. He avoided abrupt tones or sharp consonants. He understood how fragile trust could be, how easily fear could erupt into panic. The POWs watched him with wary eyes, unsure whether a shared language meant safety or a more refined form of interrogation. One of the older soldiers kept his arms crossed tightly over his chest, refusing to remove his coat. The medic didn't insist. Instead, he checked the man's temperature by placing the instrument against his neck. The POW stiffened at the first touch, his breath catching. But when nothing painful followed, confusion flickered across his face, confusion that bordered dangerously close to relief. Across the tent, 2 teenage prisoners sat side by side, knees drawn close, watching every move the Americans made. Their helmets lay beside them, revealing heads shaved unevenly by months of field conditions. They whispered anxiously, one insisting the Americans would send them to a labor camp, the other whispering that maybe, not likely, but maybe, they would be fed soon. Captain Harris entered mid-morning, scanning the room with the cold efficiency of a man responsible for keeping chaos at bay. He murmured to a medic, reviewing notes with a furrowed brow. But when he turned to look at the POWs, his expression softened. War had taught him that desperation often wore the same face regardless of the uniform. These men were not threats, they were remnants. A sudden coughing fit broke the quiet. The source, a thin young prisoner hunched over a crate, struggled to breathe. The medic rushed over, offering water and listening to his lungs with a stethoscope. The POW recoiled, thinking the object was a weapon. It took a full minute for him to understand the gesture was medical, not violent. His shoulders slowly eased as the medic nodded reassuringly. Near the tent entrance, a prisoner held tightly to a folded paper, his mother's address in Hamburg. It was the last thing he owned. When asked for it, he hesitated, eyes wide, terrified that it would be taken as evidence against him. Mason assured him softly that it was simply for records. The man surrendered it with trembling fingers, blinking rapidly to hide tears. The next group filed in with visible reluctance, glancing nervously at the previous prisoners for hints of what awaited them. But instead of screams or punishment, they saw only quiet examinations and soft questions. It confused them deeply. Fear began to shift into something far more fragile, skeptical curiosity. Outside, guards distributed thin wool blankets to those waiting. The prisoners accepted them cautiously, gripping the fabric like a test. A few pressed the wool to their faces, inhaling the faint scent of detergent, something they had not smelled in months. The moment was small, yet it carried a weight none of them could ignore. When lunchtime neared, a cook arrived to ask Captain Harris about feeding the new arrivals. The prisoners overheard only fragments, first priority, too weak, soup. But the words ignited whispers across the line. Some refused to believe it. Others dared to hope. Hunger had shaped them so thoroughly that the idea of a warm meal felt like a trick. Inside the tent, a medic carefully wrapped a bandage around a prisoner's ankle, working around the worn boot rather than asking him to remove it. The POW stared at him in shock, unable to understand why anyone would try to protect his dignity. He whispered a quiet, "Danke." The medic simply nodded, understanding without translation. A nervous murmur spread when the officers began posting identity boards. Many prisoners feared discovering their fate not through speech, but through ink. Mason translated each name patiently, correcting spellings with care. Some POWs relaxed when they saw familiar units listed. Others paled, knowing their affiliations carried darker implications. A cold breeze swept through the camp as clouds gathered above the treetops. The prisoners instinctively huddled tighter, trying to preserve what little warmth they had. But something subtle had shifted. Less shaking, fewer flinches, more glances toward the kitchen tents. Fear remained, but it was no longer the only thing living in their eyes. As afternoon settled, the medics stepped outside to clean their tools. They exchanged quiet comments about malnutrition, frostbite, and how young most of the prisoners were. The prisoners listened from a distance, confused by the concern in the Americans' voices. Concern was not something they had been taught to expect from enemies. By evening, the examinations were complete. The prisoners gathered near their tents, exhausted but strangely calmer than before. Lamps cast warm patches of light across the cold ground. For the first time since surrendering, they allowed themselves to breathe without waiting for the next blow. None of them realized that tomorrow, the day of the meal, would change everything they believed about their captors.
The third morning arrived with the faint smell of wood smoke drifting across the Bavarian encampment. German prisoners stirred restlessly, their bodies stiff from another cold night, their minds crowded with unanswered questions. No one knew what the day would bring. But when the clang of pots echoed from the American kitchen tent, every POW froze, exchanging wary, disbelieving glances. Food, real food, was the one rumor they dared not trust. Inside the cook tent, Staff Sergeant Miller ladled thick barley stew into metal containers, moving with the practiced rhythm of a man who had fed battalions under worse conditions. He wiped his brow, glanced toward the POW enclosure, and exhaled slowly. "They look half-starved," he murmured. The assistant cook nodded without speaking. Kindness in wartime was risky, but withholding it felt worse. Outside, the prisoners gathered in a tense half-circle. Some whispered that it was a trick, Americans softening them up before interrogation. Others insisted the food was only for officers. One older POW muttered that comfort always came before punishment. Their eyes followed every movement near the serving line, hope flickering too faintly to trust. Captain Harris observed from the command post, arms crossed as he watched the anxious groups. He understood the significance of this moment. Feeding an enemy wasn't merely logistics, it was psychology, diplomacy, and humanity clashing in the same breath. He ordered the guards to keep rifles lowered and gestures calm. "Let today set a tone," he said quietly. When the first prisoners were called forward, they stepped with extreme hesitation, as though approaching something sacred or dangerous, perhaps both. Their boots crunched softly in the frost-covered dirt. They carried their helmets awkwardly in both hands, turning them into makeshift bowls. Even the small act felt humiliating, yet somehow necessary. Miller filled the first helmet with stew, the steam rising like a ghost into the cold morning air. The young POW who received it stared into the warmth, eyes wide, unable to fathom why an enemy would offer sustenance. He tried to speak, but could muster only a strained nod before stepping aside, holding the improvised bowl as if it might disappear. As more prisoners approached, the line began to buzz with disbelief. Some sniffed the steam cautiously, still suspecting a trick. Others tasted a small spoonful, then froze, processing flavor, salt, warmth, things their bodies had forgotten. A man in his 40s blinked repeatedly, as if tasting something from a life he no longer recognized. A trembling POW whispered "Donkey" under his breath. Miller paused, meeting the man's eyes for a brief, meaningful second. No politics, no sides, just two exhausted humans acknowledging the weight of hunger. The camera of history would never record the moment, but it changed something fundamental in the air. Interpreter Mason walked among the prisoners, clarifying that the food was for all ranks, no interrogations required. His tone was gentle, yet firm. Many POWs struggled to believe him. They had been conditioned to expect cruelty disguised as mercy, and trust, even in the shape of warm stew, felt like stepping into thin ice. Near the end of the line, a young prisoner suddenly burst into tears as he received his portion. His shoulders shook with silent sobs, overwhelmed by the taste of something kind after months of cold rations and fear. Other prisoners looked away respectfully, unsure whether empathy was allowed among men meant to be enemies. As the meal continued, small groups formed instinctively. Old friends, former squad mates, or simply those who felt safer in proximity. They ate slowly, savoring each mouthful like an artifact. A few prisoners held their helmets close to their faces, inhaling deeply between bites, almost unbelieving that the warmth was real. One prisoner approached Mason, hesitantly tapping his sleeve. In shaky German, he asked whether they were allowed seconds. Mason smiled faintly, translating the request to Miller. The cook shrugged and waved the man forward. The prisoner stared in disbelief for a full heartbeat before stepping to the front, his voice cracking with gratitude he could not express. On the perimeter, American guards watched in silence. Many had expected hostility or suspicion, but instead they witnessed something far quieter. Men rediscovering what it meant to be treated as human beings. A few guards shifted awkwardly, unsure how to feel watching enemy soldiers cry over simple stew. Captain Harris took a slow walk around the enclosure. He noted posture changes, shoulders less rigid, faces less hollow, breaths less frantic. Fear hadn't vanished, but it had loosened its grip. He understood that morale, even in captivity, influenced order. Feeding them wasn't only compassionate, it was strategic. A prisoner with shaking hands spilled part of his stew onto the ground. Instinctively, he fell to his knees, trying to scoop it up, expecting punishment for the waste. Instead, an American guard stepped forward and offered him a fresh portion. The prisoner froze, staring up with disbelief so raw it bordered on pain. As noon approached, the kitchen tent filled with steam and low conversation. The Americans joked lightly among themselves, while the POWs spoke in hushed tones. Despite the distance, there was a faint echo of shared normalcy, voices mingling in the cold Bavarian air, creating a fragile bridge between two worlds that had spent years trying to destroy each other. When the last helmet was filled, the cook stepped back, exhausted but satisfied. The scent of stew drifted across the field, mingling with wood smoke and frost. Some POWs crouched near the fence, savoring the final drops, wiping their helmets clean with shaking fingers. These were not the gestures of defeated soldiers, but of starving men reclaiming something lost. In the mid-afternoon quiet, Mason collected empty water cans near the fence line. A prisoner approached hesitantly, offering his canteen for refill. Mason obliged without a word. For a moment their eyes met. Strangers, bound by a moment of mutual recognition, shaped not by war, but by need. As daylight faded, the POW enclosure grew calmer. Men sat shoulder to shoulder, blankets wrapped tightly, sharing murmured reflections on the unexpected meal. For some, it was the first time since surrender they'd spoken without trembling. For others, it was the first moment they allowed themselves to stop imagining the worst. That evening, the camp settled under a quiet sky. The prisoners lay down on their cots, still clutching the faint warmth of the day's unexpected mercy. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring, interrogations, transfers, decisions made far above them, but for the first time, fear wasn't the only thing in their eyes. Hope, fragile and unfamiliar, flickered beside it.
On the fourth morning, a different kind of tension filled the Bavarian camp. The air was thick, not with fear, but with the weight of something unspoken. At sunrise, a jeep returned from a nearby SS administrative post, dust coating its tires. Rumors spread quickly among the guards. Files had been recovered, real records, names, affiliations. For the first time, the prisoners sensed the Americans knew more than they had ever revealed. Captain Harris stood outside the command tent, holding a metal container filled with documents. The folders were damp from snow, the ink smudged but legible. He opened them slowly, understanding the gravity of what he held. These were not propaganda reports or second-hand claims. These were primary sources, SS rosters, hospital transfers, forced labor assignments. Some pages trembled slightly in his gloved hand. Inside the tent, Mason translated the first pages with care. Many names belonged not to combat units, but to civilian transports, nurses conscripted under threats, students taken from their villages, clerks repurposed into frontline auxiliary roles. The Americans exchanged stunned glances. The prisoners they had treated as enemy soldiers were, in some cases, unwilling participants in a collapsing regime. Outside, the POWs noticed the sudden shift in atmosphere. Guards whispered among themselves. Officers moved quickly between tents. Even without understanding English, the prisoners sensed something had changed. Anxiety rose like smoke. Some feared discovery of crimes they did not commit. Others feared being mislabeled. Silence fell over the enclosure, heavy and suffocating. When Harris finally approached the POW fence line, documents tucked beneath his arm, the prisoners stood in rigid attention. No one spoke. No one dared breathe too loudly. His expression revealed nothing, but his eyes lingered on each man with a new depth, searching, evaluating, understanding. The truth finally had shape, and it rested in the papers he carried. The first individual called forward was an older prisoner named Weber. Hands shaking, he stepped toward the gate. The guards opened it slowly, allowing him through. Harris read from a file. Weber had been a hospital orderly seized during an SS raid on a rural clinic. He was never enlisted. The man's eyes widened as if struck. All this time, he feared punishment for a crime he never chose. Next came a young prisoner barely 18. His file revealed he had been taken from a youth training school and forced into last-minute service during the final weeks of the war. His entire military record amounted to 12 days. He listened as Mason translated, mouth trembling. When Harris finished, the boy whispered a single word, "Varum," as if asking why fate had dragged him into a uniform at all. More names followed. Some prisoners were clerks assigned to ammunition depots. Others were factory workers pulled into emergency battalions. A few were indeed soldiers, but even they were shocked at how precisely the Americans now understood their pasts. The documents peeled away fear and exposed something deeper. Years of coercion, propaganda, and survival instinct masquerading as loyalty. The discovery that shook the guards most came mid-morning. One file detailed a group of civilians misclassified as combat volunteers, including 3 POWs inside the enclosure. Their documents showed they had been captured by retreating SS units and forced into uniform at gunpoint. Harris felt his chest tighten as he realized these men were victims of 2 armies, one that enslaved them, another that nearly executed them by mistake. Not all revelations were gentle. A handful of files contained darker histories, men assigned to units that had operated near partisan strongholds. Though not proof of wrongdoing, their proximity to violence cast long shadows. These prisoners watched the officers read their files with stiff, haunted expressions, unsure whether their past selves or their surroundings would determine their fate. Inside the command tent, a heated discussion erupted among American officers. Some argued for immediate separation, combatants, auxiliaries, civilians. Others warned against rushing judgment. Every file carried nuances, gray areas, contradictions. War had turned record-keeping into chaos. Survival had turned truth into something fragile. Harris rubbed his temples, feeling the moral weight pressing down on him. Back in the enclosure, prisoners waited quietly as names continued to be called. Each step toward the gate felt like walking toward a verdict. Those who returned shared fragments of what they heard, some relieved, others devastated or confused. The mixture of emotions spread through the group like ripples in cold water, leaving none untouched. One prisoner approached Mason voluntarily, offering information he had kept hidden. Hands trembling, he explained in broken English that he had been a school teacher before conscription. His file confirmed it. Mason listened gently, nodding as the man described how he had hidden students from SS patrols. The confession was not required, but the need to reclaim his identity was overwhelming. A different man tried to explain that he had been present at an atrocity but had not participated. His voice cracked as he spoke, the memories too heavy to conceal.
Harris listened without judgment, taking notes but withholding reaction. The camera of history, metaphorically and literally, had no room for assumptions. Only facts could guide them now. Near midday, snow began to fall again, light flakes drifting across the camp. The prisoners looked up in quiet unison, the weather breaking the tension for a moment. The scene felt surreal, men standing in stillness, waiting for judgment under a peaceful sky. If kindness had softened them yesterday, uncertainty reclaimed them today. After hours of review, Harris addressed the entire enclosure. Through Mason, he explained that the files would be used not for punishment, but for classification. Civilians would be separated from combatants, auxiliaries would receive different housing, younger conscripts might be released sooner. The words stunned the prisoners, many of whom had expected far harsher outcomes. The reaction was mixed. Some POWs collapsed onto crates in relief, covering their faces with their hands. Others stood frozen, struggling to process the idea that their identities mattered again after months of being treated as replaceable bodies. A few stared into the distance, haunted by memories the documents had dredged back to the surface. As evening approached, the camp grew quiet. Guards carried small lanterns between the tents, while officers finalized lists inside the command post. The POWs huddled in groups, whispering anxiously about the future. Release, transfer, accountability. For the first time, conversations centered not on fear, but on possibility. Mason visited the enclosure one last time before nightfall, offering translations and reassurance to those still confused. Several prisoners approached him voluntarily, asking if their families could be notified. Others wanted to know if their previous civilian professions could be restored or recognized. Their questions revealed something powerful, hope emerging from the ashes. As darkness settled across Bavaria, the prisoners lay awake, listening to the distant crackle of radios and the soft murmur of officers reading through files. The documents, stained, incomplete, but truthful, had reshaped their destiny. For the first time since surrendering, they felt seen not as enemies, but as individuals. The truth had arrived, and with it, the possibility of redemption.